All right, well, good morning, everybody. So great to have so many of you join us today. My name is Tanya Goldman, and I'm a senior policy attorney at the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP. My colleagues, Adewale Maye, Pranita Gupta, and I are thrilled to co-host this webinar with CWO and the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, who are both crucial partners in our economic justice work. As many of you already know, CLASP advocates for job quality standards and benefits and works closely with state and local advocates and enforcement agencies on effective and equitable implementation and enforcement of critical labor standards. As part of that work, we partner with many of you who are joining us today from states and localities who have worked with us for years to think about, innovate, and implement strategic enforcement strategies. Thank you so much for everything you all are doing to advocate with workers and on behalf of workers' rights, and particularly for low-wage workers and workers of color. Janice is going to start the introductions in a minute, but I wanted to also personally welcome and thank our fantastic panelists, Daniel and Michelle, for sharing their time and expertise with us today. And I can't resist a special welcome to David Weil, who's my own former boss and mentor in all things, including, of course, strategic enforcement. This research that the Washington Center for Equitable Growth has funded is incredibly timely and important, and I look forward to hearing with all of you more about it and next steps we can and must take to protect workers' rights in the midst of this horrible recession. I also am compelled to remind you that CLASP is a 501c3 organization, so we appreciate everyone keeping in mind during our Q&A session that we cannot participate in partisan political activity or commentary. But other than that, we welcome you to use the chat box to engage with each other and to ask questions throughout this session. So with those logistics out of the way, I'm pleased to hand it over to Catherine from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth and kindly ask to move to the next slide as well.
Thank you, Tanya. And also thank you to Dan, David, and Michelle, everyone at CLASP and CWO, Janice and Jen, everyone here for organizing this event today. So as Tanya said, my name is Catherine Zekier, and I work on labor market policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Equitable Growth is a nonprofit research and grant-making organization dedicated to advancing evidence-backed ideas and policy that promote strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth. We are thrilled to publish the report under discussion today, and I just want to add that the authors are also writing a piece based on this research that will be part of an upcoming book of 10 essays on raising wages and reducing inequality, and that will be out in January 2021. So this is a project that we're doing in partnership with the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at the University of California, Berkeley, and with funding from the Bernard and Ann Spitzer Charitable Trust. So you can sign up for email updates about that and for other publications at Equitable Growth's website. But really just wanted to say thank you to everyone again for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. I'm Janice Fine from the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization at Rutgers University. I want to thank Kaylin DeGilis for her work on organizing this webinar, and Adewale Maye for the technical support he's providing right now, and our wonderful colleagues at CLASP and our wonderful colleagues at the Washington Center on Equitable Growth for sponsoring this research. And I wanted to tell you a little bit just quickly about CWO and our Strategic Labor Standards Enforcement Project, what motivated this paper, and then quickly cut to our presenters for today. So CWO is the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization. We were founded in 2014 at Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations as a national think and do tank that's dedicated to understanding and taking on economic inequality at the root. And from the beginning, we have had a strong interest in making sure that essential cutting-edge policies like higher minimum wage, paid sick and safe time, fair scheduling, and ban the box are accompanied by cutting-edge policy implementation and enforcement. Here's how we do it. We work on a variety of issues. We do training and support to agencies across the country at the local and state level. We do work with organizations as they're thinking about and writing their policy to think about how to strengthen the enforcement and the implementation of policy. And we do all kinds of other sorts of technical advice and support. So please be in touch with us if we can support your work. And here's just a snapshot of what you'll find at our labor standards enforcement toolbox. Next slide, please, Adewale. This is just a long list of all the papers that, that we have written to support the work that we know that so many of you are doing on the ground to make this work happen. And so we have a whole series of papers. We hope that you'll take the time and go there and take advantage of those papers. And now what we'd like to do is know a little bit about what you all who are on the front lines at this moment are facing. So we'd like to put up the first poll. And this is for agencies. So very quickly, if you could just take a minute, I'll wait until the poll is up. What are the two biggest issues that you're facing at your agency? If you could, please select two of the following items to tell us the two biggest issues that you're facing. Can people see the poll? Because right now I'm seeing a blank screen. Okay, so if people could go ahead and let us know the two biggest issues that you're facing at your agency, that would be great. And then we'll show you right away what we're hearing from people. So what we're hearing is right now what we're seeing is that working from home mandates for staff, 35%, oh, yep, 33%, 62%, oh, maybe I'll wait until you're all done. It's like trying to call a horse race in the first round. People are still voting, still voting. Okay, so essentially what we're seeing is that the work from home mandates from the staff, about 33%, 54% additional work without additional funding, 10% reassignment of staff to unemployment, 39% high caseloads, 39% getting employers to respond to investigators. So that just gives us a quick snapshot of the situation on the ground for agencies. And now we'd like to ask organizations if we could also quickly poll you on the two biggest issues you're facing in your organization. So Adewale, can you please put up the next poll? So once again, okay. So what are the two biggest issues faced by workers in your organization? Please select two of the following. Layoffs, can't find a job, qualifying or applying for UI, unemployment insurance, wage theft, paid sick violations, or retaliation. Adewale, this is the old version. It's not the version that has reaching an agency. Maybe could you just, is it too late to, okay. Okay, so here we're seeing that let's see, about equal, layoffs, can't find a job, about 40%, and also qualifying or applying for UI, about 35% wage theft, and about 43% paid sick violations, and 35% retaliation. So, so that just gives us a bit of a snapshot in terms of what people are facing now. So now I'd like to move on to the study and the introductions. So I'll start with saying that in a nutshell, the study was motivated by our concerns about low-wage workers in the time of COVID and the recession. We knew that these workers were already at very high risk of contracting the virus, that there were major health and safety challenges. And we already knew that the majority of essential workers were low wage, earning less than $20 an hour. What we didn't know was how the severe recession would impact them in terms of basic labor standards protections. So we decided to look back at the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, to understand how workers fared back then as the best preview of what we could expect this time around. As you will hear in a moment, what we found is quite worrisome. So without any further ado, please let me introduce today's presenters. First, my wonderful colleague, Dan Galvin. He's an associate professor of political science at Northwestern University and a CWO fellow. He's working on strategic enforcement initiatives with our team. He holds a PhD from Yale, is currently an associate professor of political science and a faculty fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern. His research examines the relationship between labor and employment policies, labor market outcomes, changing forms of worker organization, and the politics of worker rights. As you'll see, Daniel has published empirical analyses of minimum wage noncompliance at the state level, including a study demonstrating that stronger state enforcement capacities and the introduction of higher penalties for noncompliance, especially treble damages, significantly reduce the incidence of wage theft. He also constructed a new data on the proliferation of state-level employment policies over the last half century. So I hope you'll check out his work. It's really fantastic. Jen Round is a senior fellow with the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization Labor Standards Enforcement Project, and she's the former enforcement manager at the Seattle Office of Labor Standards. She's leading our work on strategic enforcement initiatives. She's a prolific writer and a visionary thinker about labor standards policy and enforcement. Prior to the Seattle Office of Labor Standards, Jen has played an integral role in planning, implementing, and managing numerous legal programs, including overseeing enforcement of Seattle's labor standards laws, developing a culturally relevant program designed to reduce domestic violence in rural Alaska, and creating an undergraduate law degree program at the American University of Afghanistan. And she holds a JD from the George Washington University School of Law and a Master's of Law in Sustainable International Development from the University of Washington Law School. David Weil, our hero, is the Dean of the Heller School at Brandeis, the former administrator of the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. He became the Dean and Professor of the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis in August of 2017. Prior to that, he was the Wexler Professor of Management at Boston University's Questrom School of Business. He was appointed by President Barack Obama to be the administrator of the Wage and Hour Division of the U.S. Department of Labor and was the first Senate-confirmed head of that agency in a decade. He led Wage and Hour from 2014 to January 2017. Michelle Holder, Assistant Professor of Economics at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York. Prior to joining John Jay, she worked professionally as an economist for a decade in both the nonprofit and government sectors. Her research focuses on the Black community and women of color in the American labor market, and her economic policy reports have been covered by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Amsterdam News, and El Diario. Michelle has also appeared on or been quoted in media outlets such as CNN, the Washington Post, National Public Radio, the New Yorker, and PBS. And her first book, African American Men and the Labor Market During the Great Recession, was released from Palgrave Macmillan in 2017. So you can see we have an incredible panel. So we're going to start by hearing about the results of the study itself with Dan Galvin.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Janice, and thanks everyone for being here. As Janice mentioned, the unprecedented spike in unemployment in April was what motivated us to look into this relationship between unemployment and minimum wage violations, which is, of course, one of the most pernicious forms of wage theft. So in this study, we ask, is there a relationship? What is the nature of that relationship? And what does that suggest about strategies of labor standards enforcement? So Adewale, if you turn to the next slide, please. First, we turn to the last recession, right? When there was a steep increase in unemployment followed by a slow, gradual recovery thereafter. To see if there was any effect on the incidence of wage theft, we used the Current Population Survey, which is widely considered to be the best publicly available data on wages and hours, to estimate minimum wage violations among workers in the bottom quintile of each state's wage distribution. The technique is actually pretty simple. We compare workers' self-reported wages to the applicable state or local minimum wage to identify whether they were paid less than what they were owed. And then that individual level data can then be used to estimate violation rates across states, industries, demographic groups, and so on. No data is perfect, and CPS is no exception. And I'd be happy to discuss some of the limitations of the data and the steps we took to mitigate those issues in the Q&A. But if, Adewale, you turn to the next slide, please. Looking across states at the relationship between unemployment and minimum wage violations, we find a rather striking overtime relationship. As states' unemployment rates increased, so too did the average statewide rate of minimum wage violations. It increased from about 11% to about 16% on average. And as state unemployment rates began to fall, so too did the average minimum wage violation rate, slowly tracking the slow recovery. But this is a pretty high level of aggregation. So in the next slide, please, we also asked, what's the probability that any individual worker would experience a minimum wage violation between 2007 and 2013, conditional on their state's unemployment rate? And here what we see is that the probability ranged from about 9% to about 22%, depending on the quarter in which they were paid less than the minimum wage. Excuse me. Of course, the violation rate is affected by many things, not just the economy of the state in which the worker works. In particular, some groups of workers are more vulnerable than others. So in the next slide, please, we see that non-citizens were more than twice as likely to experience a minimum wage violation as US citizens. So 114% means that their probability was a little more than 2 times greater. Workers coded as Hispanic were 84% more likely than white workers, Black workers 41% more likely, women were 43% more likely than men. Of course, human identities are multidimensional, and when the interaction of gender, race, and citizenship are taken into account, we find that the effects of discrimination are compounded. So for example, Hispanic women who were not US citizens, they were 4 times more likely to experience wage theft than white male US citizens. Non-citizen Black women were about 3.7 times more susceptible. We also found that union members were more than 3 times less likely to experience a minimum wage violation than workers who did not belong to a union. Unfortunately, we know that many of these workers who are doubly or triply vulnerable to discrimination and wage theft on account of their race, gender, and citizenship are either unaware of their rights or fearful of complaining when they're underpaid, even in good economic times, which presents a problem for complaint-driven enforcement models. So if you'll turn to the next slide, please. Working with the San Francisco Office of Labor Standards Enforcement, we set out to compare the number of complaints the San Francisco agency received for minimum wage violations by industry to our estimates during the period stretching from 2005 to 2018. And as David Weil and Amanda Piles note in their seminal 2005 piece, which we try to replicate in part here, in complaint-based enforcement systems, ideally we want everyone to fall in quadrants 1 and 4, in the top left and bottom right. So most complaints should be coming from the least compliant industries, and the most compliant industries should be seeing the fewest complaints. What we don't want to see are industries where there's lots of non-compliance, but low complaint rates, which is quadrant 2. But that's exactly what we found in private households and social assistance and food manufacturing industries. In all 3 industries, it's worth noting women, non-citizens, and people of color are disproportionately represented. There are lots of reasons why these workers might not complain, which is an issue that Jen Round will circle back to in a minute. But what this underscores is that complaint-driven enforcement models are clearly failing to protect some of our most vulnerable workers who face multiple forms of discrimination and who can least afford to be underpaid. Another way to think of the numbers is on the next slide. In the private households industry, you'll see for every 1 complaint made to the San Francisco Enforcement Agency, we estimate that there were more than 1,300 violations that occurred but went unreported. For every 1 complaint in the social assistance industry, we estimate over 800 unreported violations. These are workers who are falling through the cracks in San Francisco, right, which is home to one of the best and most experienced labor standards enforcement agencies in the country. across good times and bad times in the economy from 05 to 18. So we might think of these workers in these industries as kind of always falling through the cracks. Adiwali, if you'll flip to the next slide, please, we can see that in the midst of the last recession, a number of other industries, not really the usual suspects, stood out as particularly susceptible to wage theft. These industries didn't have the highest violation rates. Private households and the usual suspects did, but they saw the greatest percentage point increase in minimum wage violations during the recession as compared to before the recession. So the hardest hit industries during the COVID recession, of course, are likely to be different still. So for example, we know that COVID has severely affected leisure and hospitality, retail, meatpacking, agriculture, restaurants, and more. So our worry is that these COVID affected industries too could see steep increases in wage theft while shifting from other quadrants into that most problematic quadrant 2. With no realistic exit option amid high unemployment, workers in those industries could be suffering silently and not complaining, and therefore not getting paid what they're owed. What's more, as states are being forced to slash their budgets and lay off public sector workers, enforcement agencies are under great stress. And as many of you, I'm sure, know better than I do. And more low-wage workers, in other words, may be falling through the cracks than usual. And all of this amounts to a really big problem, because even if minimum wage violations allow some workers to keep their jobs at sub-minimum wages, if you will, which they might prefer, it can undermine the wage structure across entire industries or cities by providing an advantage to low-road employers, penalizing stronger firms that are in compliance, and producing kind of a race to the bottom. Race to the bottom. Moreover, struggling businesses shouldn't be allowed to compensate for their profit losses by illegally paying their workers less than the minimum wage. Even if some workers are eventually made whole, most won't be, and in either case, those who can least afford it are effectively being forced to subsidize their struggling employers with involuntary interest-free loans. But as unemployment goes up and those exit options diminish, and many people may feel that they have no choice but to quietly accept whatever their employer pays them rather than complain and risk losing their job. This isn't a choice that the law allows or anticipates, or that enforcement agencies anticipate, but we find that it happens nonetheless. Excuse me. In the final data analysis, Adewale, if you'll switch to the next slide, we examined a survey of California workers in April, all of whom did in fact have access to California's paid sick leave policy. And a surprising number, 35% of all workers, that's the number in the top left corner, didn't know they had access or didn't believe that they could use it. But we also see significant variation by race and income level. So Latinx workers were more likely than average to report that they didn't think they'd be paid if they had to take time off to recover from COVID. And they were more likely to think that this was a serious problem, alongside reduced wages and hours and dangerous working conditions. And Black workers also reported in higher rates than white workers on these same questions. And then in the next slide, we also see in the same survey that the perceived access to paid sick leave, Adewale, if you'd switch to the next slide, please. It varies also with income level and union membership, with union families significantly more likely to report access to paid sick leave than non-union families. But of course, there are many fewer union families today than in the past. So to sum up the data, the empirical analysis, what we find is that in the context of high unemployment, low-wage workers are at increased risk of being paid less than the minimum wage. But given the near universality of complaint-driven enforcement systems, we won't necessarily know that this is happening, right? That this form of wage theft is occurring. Many of the workers who are getting ripped off also report a lack of access to policy benefits and protections. And this is especially the case for poor people of color who are already vulnerable to discrimination and can least afford to be left on their own. So I will now pass the baton to my colleague and friend, Jen Round. And there you are.
Thanks so much, Dan. I want to start by thanking everyone from agencies and organizations that have continued to work to protect the rights of workers, despite the countless challenges the last few months have brought. That you have made the time to join us today with all you have on your plates is yet one more demonstration of your dedication, and we are so grateful that you are here with us today. I want to send extra love to everyone in Seattle who recently lost a dear friend and colleague. You've all very much been in my thoughts and my heart. So David is going to talk more specifically about strategic enforcement, but I wanted to quickly highlight a couple of the big takeaways from this report, some of which Dan has already touched on a little bit. First, in talking with agencies over the last few months, we've heard a number of times that agencies haven't seen a rise in minimum wage complaints. What this report tells us is that a lack of complaints does not mean there has not been a rise in minimum wage violations. In fact, what this study indicates is that given the high rate of unemployment we've seen in the wake of the pandemic, it's highly likely that violations have increased. It's also unsurprising that a rise in violations hasn't necessarily led to a rise in complaints. David Weil's research and our studies with Dan, that Dan mentioned earlier, have demonstrated that even when the economy is doing well, we know that some of the most regularly exploited workers are among the least likely to complain. The discrepancy between complaints and violations is largely the result of asymmetries of power between low-wage workers and the firms for which they work. Workers with the least power and few alternative employment options face barriers that keep them from stepping forward to complain much of the time. In a recession, high unemployment increases workers' desperation to maintain any job, thus tipping the power imbalance even further toward firms. We would expect in the current recession that workers, especially those in the hardest hit industries, are highly vulnerable to violations, but unlikely to file a complaint out of fear of losing their jobs. This means that to protect workers in this environment, agencies cannot rely exclusively on complaints as a means for triggering investigations. The pandemic recession has made strategic enforcement more important than ever. Second, the rise in worker vulnerability means that co-enforcement, or partnering with worker centers, unions, legal advocacy organizations, and other community-based organizations that are trusted by vulnerable worker communities and that understand high violation sectors is crucial for effective enforcement in a recession. Through the relationships and local credibility, community organizations can educate workers, encourage them to file complaints, and help to gather testimony and documentation. Drawing on workers' networks, community organizations can also encourage workers to cooperate in the enforcement process by providing a safe space, interpretation and facilitation services, as well as helping investigators meet with workers who may be too intimidated to engage with a government office on their own. They also exercise a kind of moral power and broaden public support for robust enforcement when they document and publicize egregious examples of patterns of abuse. In addition to strategic enforcement and co-enforcement, I also want to note that the study has a list of policy recommendations to strengthen enforcement powers at the federal level. However, those recommendations are all based on innovations we've seen in state and local labor standards laws. So that section could provide ideas for policymakers at the state and local level as well. Of those recommendations, I wanted to briefly highlight the need for prioritizing retaliation protections. Given the increase in worker vulnerability and the difficulty many low-wage workers may face in finding a new job, protecting workers who do speak up is incredibly important. To strengthen retaliation protections, a number of states and cities have included a rebuttable presumption that an adverse action taken against a person within 90 days of a protected activity was retaliatory. So, for example, if a worker were to file a complaint or testify in an investigation, and within 90 days, the employer terminated that worker or reduced their hours, it is presumed under the law that the employer's actions was retaliation, which the employer can rebut if they have sufficient evidence to show that they took the action for legitimate reasons. This presumption makes retaliation easier to prove and better protects workers. Now, we know that agencies across the US play very different roles in passing legislation, and while some are closely tied to passing new laws or amendments, others are unable to advocate for legislative changes. Thus, getting laws passed that provide stronger enforcement powers, like creating a rebuttable presumption of retaliation, is another place where partnering with community organizations is hugely important. We discuss this more and provide resources for agencies to assess their powers in 2 new papers we just posted as part of our enforcement toolkit, both of which were authored by Kaylin DeHelius, that Janice highlighted earlier. So we urge all of you to go check those out. Additionally, we'll be following up this webinar with a webinar series on enforcement in a recession, and we will cover the topic of enforcement powers in one of those webinars. In the meantime, if we can be a resource, please contact us. And with that, I will turn it over to David.
David, just briefly, let me remind people that there's a chat function and we will be taking your question. So we'd really like it. We would really appreciate it if you could go to the chat. and then put any questions you have for us. And after we hear from our last speaker, Michelle Holder, we'll turn to your questions. So please go to the chat. Thanks. Sorry, David.
Thanks, Janice, and thanks to CWO, CLASP, and Equitable Growth for inviting me to participate in this webinar. Jen Round already started to get into the topic about going from the results of the study that Dan Galvin took us through into the, so what do you do? And I also send out my hats off to all of you on the front line of dealing with the problem of wage theft, whether you're working in a state and local agency or working in one of the many worker advocacy groups that address this kind of work day in and day out. It's important to understand the context of the problem, as I think this program, this project and paper wonderfully lay out. But at the end of the day, we do need to think about how do you turn that into actionable steps from the perspective, particularly of enforcement. And that's what I'd like to spend a little bit of my time talking about. If I could have the next slide, please. Dan Galvin and Jen Round both talked about the inherent problem of complaint-based systems where only in an ideal world do the complaints come from the places with the highest priorities in terms of where the biggest problems are. But we know from a lot of empirical analysis and as presented most recently in the paper that we're discussing today, very often the people most at risk are the least likely to complain. And that is obviously further compounded in a world of high unemployment, where working people have to be understandably preoccupied of simply maintaining their job, and therefore will be all the more reticent to complain. That creates a profound problem for a regulatory and enforcement agency in order to figure out how then do you do your work where you can't rely upon the ongoing incoming complaints that are coming to your desk. And the idea of strategic enforcement is really born out of thinking about how do you deal with that problem from the perspective of an agency. If I could have the next slide. Let me start with just a simple definition of what is strategic enforcement. What do we mean by that concept? I would define strategic enforcement really around its objective, and its objective is to use the limited enforcement resources that are always a constraint on any enforcement agency that are available to that agency, to use them proactively to protect workers as required by the law by changing employer behavior in a sustainable way. So what do I mean by that? Well, I've bolded, I think, the key concepts in that definition and that really need to drive the idea of strategic enforcement. First of all, as you all revealed in the poll results, a regulatory agency under any circumstance is always not going to have enough resources, not enough investigators, not enough administrative staff, computer capacity, all the things that make an enforcement agency work. There will always be limits on that. That is further compounded, as your poll answers indicated, in a period of time of financial stress like we're currently in. So we have to think about how to use each of those precious resources, particularly investigator hours, to greatest effect. The second bolded word I put in the definition is proactively. It's very easy to fall into the trap to be reactive to incoming complaints. We've already seen the evidence about why that's a problem. It's also a problem because if we're reacting, we are never in front of the underlying problems that an agency needs to address, the underlying causes of wage theft. And so the proactive piece is to really trying to get in front of what's driving the particular state of affairs in a given industry among a given workforce that's resulting in wage theft. and then building approaches around that understanding, around what my former boss, the Secretary of Labor, Tom Perez, used to call the theory of the case. The third element I've highlighted here in this definition is changing employer behavior. It's very easy, particularly in a reactive context, to think about the purpose of the agency as directly restoring back wages to workers. That is absolutely critical, basic, and foundational, obviously, to doing what laws require us to do at the federal, state, or local level. But at the same time, if we just look at the compliance of the set of workers we are doing an investigation about, we miss the opportunity to use those limited resources in the biggest, in the greatest way and to the largest effect. And that's why I'm emphasizing here the changing of employer behavior, trying to figure out how by this investigation can I make sure in the future, not only does this employer comply, but other employers who might be in the same industry or the same geographic area or drawing from the same workforce will change their behavior in the future. We sometimes call that, in academic lingo, the deterrence impact of enforcement. The final thing I've emphasized here is sustainable way, and that's the idea that, again, going back to our limited resources, if we don't change behavior in a way that will stick, if we don't somehow move the needle so that this set of employers or this set of organizations no longer continue to act and respond to whatever's driving them to non-compliance, we're going to be just sort of winning a victory today and then losing it tomorrow. So we have to think about the sustainability of how we're doing that. Now, if I could have the next slide, I'm going to give you a long list, and I'm not going to go through this in detail. Many of these things are discussed in the report. Others are discussed in other literature that I know CWO has collected in work that I and other people have done in this area. But I just want to highlight a couple of points here. I would first make the overall observation that this long list, it's not a laundry list. I would regard this as the core pieces of a strategic enforcement approach. But because there are multiple bullet points here, it says there's no one silver bullet. There's no one answer. It's not sufficient to only do one thing. We have to think about a whole set of activities, a whole way of thinking differently about enforcement to really get traction and achieve some of the objectives that I just described that strategic enforcement sets out to do. So let me just highlight a couple of these. Some Jen has already spoken about. First of all, is moving to this proactive approach. One of the things that has to be done to do that is move away from a complaint-based approach and deploy resources in a more proactive, directed way. That is not easy. We can talk about some of the challenges in doing so when we have our question and answer and conversation. Secondly, the idea of then setting enforcement priorities. After we have moved or have been able to move some of our resources towards more proactive investigations, and then we have to figure out where are we going to try to have impact? What are the major areas that are our priorities? Dan Galvin, in discussing that grid in detail, talked about a couple of industries or workforce, domestic workforce that we might need to turn to. That's a statement of enforcement priorities, figuring out where we need to be spending our time. The third element I've outlined here is about using enforcement tools and all enforcement tools. Now, the report lays out some new tools that are advocated as things to add to the toolbox. I would urge you all to look into your existing toolbox. I can tell you when I ran Wage and Hour and during the Obama administration, the Wage and Hour Division realized we had tools in our toolbox we hadn't adequately used. I would bring attention to two of those. One was the use of collecting liquidated damages, which are the equivalent back wage, doubling back wage recoveries to compensate workers for the fact that they lost wages over a longer period of time and not just in the back wage period. We also used the hot goods provision. And we took a lot of heat for using the hot goods provision, but is a very powerful part of the Fair Labor Standards Act. that allows the wage and hour division to stop the movement of goods that have been found to be in violation of minimum wage or overtime rules or child labor rules. Very powerful provision we always had, but we had to figure out how to use that. Think about your own agency and what you currently have available and how that can be leveraged. Fourth point gets into the issue Jen Round talked about. Janice Fine has done an enormous amount of work in, and that is the improving outreach to workers and worker advocates. What Janice in her work calls co-enforcement. It is figuring out how do worker advocacy organizations, unions work with agencies to do their work. Not an easy task, again, something we can talk about in questions and answers, but really essential to using enforcement resources to greatest effect for a variety of reasons discussed in the report. I've moved down to the final point on my list. We can talk about the others again in discussion, and that's building a culture of planning, evaluation, review, and continuing improvement. Things don't change if you don't look at them, measure them, and hold people accountable for doing them. This was a major part of our strategy at Wage and Hour. We had to really think about how do we change the way this organization operates? How do we get the things that strategic enforcement operates around by changing the way we did our work? In the next slide, if I could, Adewale, I just want to show you what we did. What I'm talking about certainly was motivated by years of academic research studying the work of agencies and my own research, but also looking at the work of a lot of other great academics doing work in this area. But it was also a result of actually doing the work and having the honor of serving as wage and hour administrator and working with an incredibly talented group of political staff and even more so our wonderful set of career public servants in the wage and hour division. We decided to measure three particular aspects to say, how are we doing on the elements of strategic enforcement? One was the percentage of our investigations we were moving to this directed, proactive way. When we began, as this figure will show, it might be a little hard to see, when we began our real effort at instituting strategic enforcement way back in the first term of the Obama administration in 2010, about 26% of investigations were being done on this proactive basis. I can tell you by the end of our term, we were approaching 50%. And actually in 2017, by the year end, a year where a lot of the momentum of policies we put in place, I think were still happening, we crossed that threshold and more than half of investigations done by the Wage and Hour Division were being done on a proactive basis. The other two lines are measures to make sure that we were going to the right places, that we were directing enforcement in the right way. And these were what was called the no violation rate, which is basically the percentage of investigations where you go and you don't find anything. You've essentially used an important resource to little avail. And what you see by the two downward sloping lines, one is the complaint no violation rate. That is investigations triggered by complaints, what they went to. That started in somewhere around 26% in 2010. By the end of the period, it was down to 15%. So even complaints we were doing in a more strategic way. But importantly, the directed investigation rate also decreased significantly, even before this period of time. Something around 35% of investigations resulted in no violations. Because of targeting, because of the hard work of putting in place strategic enforcement, by the end of 2017, that rate had gone down to 14%. Lots to talk about how we achieved that, but watching that, evaluating that, and constantly adjusting organizational routines was at the key of it. If I could go, not to the next slide, well, let's go to the next slide and then go to the one at that, because I want to sum up here and turn it over to Michelle. Next slide, please. Thank you. The report nicely plays out how to think about this strategic enforcement approach at multiple stages of changing the way the investigative process is actually done, something many of you on this call, I'm sure, will be really informed by the detail that really saying, even at the time we deploy investigators and do their work, we need to think very comprehensively about how to do that better to achieve strategic enforcement. What the overall message I would leave you with is, as someone who has had the honor of serving on the front line, I will certainly acknowledge to you all something I'm sure most of you are thinking about. It ain't simple. What we're talking about is really changing the way an organization works, how it interacts with other organizations, particular worker organizations. And I fully acknowledge it's a difficult, time-based kind of thing to pull off. But what I also say with great optimism, and from my experience in doing it, it can be done, and it can be done successfully. And not only can it be done, it needs to be done. And for some of sort of the more global view about why it's so essential, let me now turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you so much, David. So, hi everyone, I'm Michelle Holder. I am a labor economist and I teach at John Jay College City, University of New York. And so I'm going to basically, I guess, give the 30,000-foot view of my impressions of the report based on the research that I do, which is I look at groups in the American labor market that tend to be disfavored or marginalized. And that would include Black workers, Latinx workers, women, and an intersection of those groups, right? Women of color. Next slide, please. So it was telling to me that that many of the groups that I look at are the very same groups, right, that are vulnerable to wage theft. Blacks, Latinxes, women, undocumented workers, and low-wage workers. So it's unfortunate, but it wasn't a surprise to me. The very groups whose status in the American labor force that I examined are the same groups who tend to have higher unemployment rates, lower average and median wages, and also encounter discrimination from employers. Discrimination does still happen in the American workforce. One metric of that is, how many people file complaints that they believe discrimination has occurred in their company, given a particular characteristic, whether it be gender, race, ethnicity, disability status, sexuality, etc. And so that's certainly one metric. Now, because of these vulnerabilities, I would say groups that tend to have higher unemployment rates tend to have lower median and average wages. Groups that tend to encounter discrimination in the American labor market. These characteristics are also what make these workers susceptible to wage theft from employers, right? Next slide, please. So clearly the report looked at the last cyclical downturn in this country, the Great Recession. Now, this is not to imply, of course, that wage theft doesn't occur during non-recessionary times. It does. I'm sure I'm not the only one either on this panel or in the audience who would, agree that how many times have we heard reports in the news, in the media, about primarily restaurant workers, right, whose tips were obfuscated by their employers, right? Countless times. And of course, we also know that restaurants, it's part of the industry in quadrant 1 of the matrix that both David and Dan talked about. Although the problematic quadrant was really quadrant 2, but quadrant 1 included industries where there's both high non-compliance and high complaint rates. That would include restaurants, the food industry. So we've heard these stories, during prosperous times even, right? So we know that it happens not only during cyclical contractions, but it happens other times as well. But recessions are usually periods of high unemployment, typically periods of high unemployment. And this lends itself, right, to decreased leverage of workers who actually have jobs, let alone folks who are looking for work and willing to accept lower wages. And so I just want to, sort of give you a thought exercise. Think of it this way in terms of why it is that recessions tend to pose more problems, right, for workers who are not favored in the American workforce, given certain indicators like lower wages, higher unemployment. So when the unemployment rate is low, right, in the United States, this is the time where inflation, there's a risk of inflation increasing. And this is a time where the Federal Reserve typically watches what happens to inflation. And the reason for that is when the unemployment rate is low, workers have more leverage, right? And this is a time where they have more leverage to ask for higher wages or better or more benefits. And so that, although that doesn't always happen during low periods of unemployment, for example, after the 2000-2001 cyclical downturn, typically low unemployment and high inflation oftentimes go hand in hand, partly because workers have more power and can demand higher wages. And with higher wages, there's more money in the economy, and prices tend to go up. And of course, the inflation rate is the average increase in prices over time. So think about it in the reverse, right? When instead of unemployment being low, when the unemployment rate is low, when it's high, workers have less leverage. And so this is a prime period for employers to engage in behaviors that they may not ordinarily engage in, right, when the unemployment rate is low and workers have a bit more power. Now, with regard to labor market outcomes, groups who have been historically the most vulnerable during recessions, which would include Black workers, women and men, right, Latinx workers, women and men, low-wage workers, women and men, and workers with lower levels of educational attainment, women and men. The reason that these workers are, some of the reasons that these workers become more vulnerable during recessions, aside from the fact that this is a time period where worker power is generally weakened, these groups that I just talked about, Black Americans, Latinxes, women, low-wage workers, workers with lower levels of educational attainment, part of their vulnerability lies in the fact that they are crowded into certain industries and occupations. And it is those very industries and occupations that have more exposure during cyclical downturns. For example, during the Great Recession, the industries where there was considerable job loss included the so-called goods producing industries, right? Manufacturing, construction. And that is because, people are not buying things. They're not buying homes. They're not buying cars. They're not buying clothes or fancy sneakers. And so the goods producing sector, where men and Black workers tend to be located, is a sector that was quite disaffected during the Great Recession. Now, the current cyclical downturn is a little bit different in nature, right? Because the industries that experienced slowdown in activity during the early part of the pandemic was a result of direct government intervention, right? States and the federal government calling for certain industries to be targeted. So the normal groups that you would think of being disaffected during a recession, such as men and lower wage workers, right? They weren't necessarily the same groups disaffected during the early part of the recession. However, during the early part of the, I'll call it the COVID recession. However, in most cases, I hate to use the term, but an organic recession or an organic cyclical downturn, the sectors of the economy, the goods producing sector, more so than the services producing sector, tends to get hit pretty hard pretty quickly. And this is precisely where Black workers are located, male workers are located. And so during the Great Recession, you know, one of the things I researched and wrote about was the effect on African-American men who had double-digit employment. But my ultimate point is that part of the vulnerability that workers experience during recessions often lies in the industries that they are located in. And so we saw with the pandemic recession, service industries were targeted, and lo and behold, it was women who were and women of color, especially African-American and Latinas, who were experiencing higher unemployment rates. So I just want to, you know, make sure that the audience kind of gets a sense of why it is certain workers are more affected during a cyclical downturn in terms of job loss. And it really has to do with where they're located in the American economy in terms of sectoral distribution and occupational distribution. Next slide, please. So I did want to talk a little bit about the effect on wages with regard to the issue of wage theft. So again, I'm going to give the sort of counter narrative so that we can all collectively wrap our heads around this. One of the reasons why employers resist minimum wage increases, is not just because it increases wages for the lowest paid workers, but it actually also has an upward pressure on workers who earn just above the minimum wage, right? So similarly, widespread wage theft that is accommodated, it sends the wrong signal to employers in the industry in terms of, I'm sorry, I actually timed myself. Let me turn to, so I'll wrap up quickly because I'm almost out. I'm actually out of my 10 minutes. I'll just take 1 or 2 more minutes, okay, Janice? And so, you know, similarly, when wage theft occurs, it's a signaling thing, right? That this is acceptable to other employers in the industry that this is occurring. And also it not only affects the lowest paid workers, but it also affects the workers who make just above minimum wage. It essentially has a downward pressure on both the lowest paid workers and those who make just above what the lowest paid workers make. And I'd also like to point out that, and this is something that Dan mentioned, you know, it's also the case that employers who are abiding by wage laws, right, are also penalized and potentially forced out of the industry by those other employers in the industry who are, you know, thieving the wages of their workers, right? Because the employers who are engaging in this behavior, this illicit behavior, illegal behavior, they are experiencing lower costs. And the employers who are abiding by wage laws are experiencing, relatively speaking to the first group, higher costs, right? So it pushes out companies that are doing the right thing. The other thing that, you know, that I want to point out, and everyone knows this, low wage workers in many different sectors are already not earning a living wage. There are about 29 states and the District of Columbia who each has a minimum wage that is above the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, right? Because that figure is incredibly low. But what does that say? That says there are 20 other states where the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, right? States can have their own minimum wage, and workers in a state get the higher of the two, right? So if a state has its own minimum wage, workers in that state will are entitled to the higher of either the federal minimum wage or their state's minimum wage. And so we have 20 states where the minimum wage, either they have a state minimum wage and it is not above $7.25 an hour, or they don't have a state minimum wage, right? So if you think about workers in those states, you know, not in theory, but in practice, a person working full-time year-round earning $7.25 an hour, if that person is a part of a family of two, say it's a worker and a spouse, or a single parent, a single mother or a single father, they are technically poor, right? Because if you work full-time year-round at $7.25 an hour, you are earning $15,000 a year. That is below the federal poverty threshold of $17,000 a year for a family of two. So those are truly the working poor, which is a term that should be antithetical to us in this country, right? You shouldn't be working full-time and still be poor. In any case, my point is that many of these workers who are experiencing wage theft are already not earning living wages as we would understand them, and as the federal government has determined with official poverty thresholds. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So I'm just going to bring this back to my research, just to summarize why the issue of wage theft is so important. So I've looked at the issue of undercompensation for African-American women in the United States, and meaning that I've looked at the gender wage gap issue, right? We've all heard that term, but in fact, where women of color are concerned, they don't just experience penalties regarding their gender and their wages in the American workforce, but they also experience penalties regarding either their race or their ethnicity, right? And so what I found was that when I looked at the issue of how the gender wage gap was affecting the African American community in the United States, I compared apples to apples. What's the difference between what a Black woman, similarly qualified, similarly educated, similarly experienced as her white male counterparts in different industries and occupations, what is she not receiving in terms of what her white male counterpart is receiving with respect to wages? And so using 3 different methodologies, just a quick plug, this paper was done for an organization called the Roosevelt Institute. It's called The Double Gap in the Bottom Line. I quantified using 3 different methodologies, including one independent. So I used 2 methodologies and there was a third methodology. I quantified that the loss to the African-American community on an annual basis from Black women being underpaid due to the gender and racial wage gaps was $50 billion a year. That's a conservative estimate. So my sort of summarizing point here is that we tend to think of things like the gender wage gap and wage violations by employers as affecting individuals, right? As sort of anecdotal, when in fact there's a community effect. And things like wage theft not only impact that worker and that worker's family, but it impacts that worker's community. And in my quantification of the gender wage gap that faced Black women in the United States, a $50 billion loss per year, one could imagine how those resources could be deployed precisely during a cyclical downturn like the COVID pandemic that we're in. And my final point is that I found it quite intriguing that in terms of my research, where I look at the wage gap, and what I found was that if we look at major racial and ethnic and gender demographic groups in the United States, it's really women of color who are paid the least among all workers. And this coincides quite intriguingly with the fact that the report also finds that it is women of color who are immigrants, right, who are the most vulnerable to wage theft. And so that says to me, in terms of the policy foci, right, where we should concentrate our policy efforts, we really need to look at, immigrant and undocumented women of color, specifically because, first of all, they are the lowest paid on average. And second of all, according to CWO's report, they really are the most vulnerable group with regard to wage theft. Thank you so much for your time. And I turn it back.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and David and Jen and Daniel for those fantastic and super helpful presentations. I know some people have to drop off at the hour, but we have some really great questions, and I think we're going to have a great conversation. So for folks who can stay on another 15 minutes or so, I will start facilitating the Q&A with our panelists. And for those who are still trying to ask questions, under the GoToWebinar control panel, you should see a drop-down menu for questions, and we'll be sure to pass them along, even if we don't get through all of them. So I'll get us started. I have two questions from Susan Lambert. The first is for Dan. How does the risk of being paid less than the minimum wage vary by business size? And before you answer, I'll just flag Susan has one other question, which is, what employer characteristics beyond industry help explain employment regulation violations, including EEOC violations? For example, within food service, which employers might be strategically targeted for enforcement?
Yeah, those are great questions. And Susan Lambert, of course, is a professor at the University of Chicago down the street, and has done amazing work on unstable work schedules. So Susan, thanks for being here and for your question. So the CPS data doesn't provide measurements of establishment size. Our report doesn't get into that, but the sort of famous Broken Laws and Unprotected Workers report that Annetta Bernhard and others put together in 2009 found that companies with fewer than 100 employees had almost double the rate of minimum wage violations as compared to businesses with 100 employees or more. And also their overtime violation rate was 82%, whereas those with larger places with over 100 employees was 52%. So there seems to be a significant relationship. There may be other studies that I'm not aware of that delve into that question more. I'm going to have to punt on the second question to one of my colleagues because I don't know the answer, but maybe one of you do.
Did David, Michelle, or Jen want to jump in yet? Or you want me to move on to another question? We'll circle back around. Okay, well, I'll come back to that and read it out again. So question for David, which is, would you characterize a proactive strategic investigation that is part of a larger strategic campaign still as directed, even if there are also complainants who are reporting to the agency or to worker organizations who are reporting on their behalf? And David, I have a couple of questions for you, so we'll start with that one.
It's a great question, and the short answer is yes, of course. Complaints have the problems I described, but they also have an enormous amount of information. One of the things we did at the Wage and Hour Division is not only did we change and move towards directed investigations, we created new protocols for triaging our complaint investigations and really trying to figure out, tease out what can we learn from them. Let me just give you a couple of examples of that. Number one is if you see a pattern, obviously, of complaints around the same employer or around a group of employers. I remember a really interesting discussion I had. A lot of what I would do when I was at Wage and Hour was to travel to district offices when we were really trying to get people to understand what does strategic enforcement mean. And I had a discussion, I remember, with one of our offices in Connecticut, where our investigators had looked at a bunch of complaints, and from other back work they did, realized there was a common accounting company that was feeding information to a group of employers that were all clients of this one accountant. That's a really cool use in a very kind of a localized area of an enforcement effort that then became focused on that accountant and the practices of that accountant and its impact on wage theft. I would also say the other place we worked very hard, partly through triage and complaints, but linking it to initiatives we had going. As Tanya Goldman, who worked closely with me back in the wage and hour division days, knows, we had a huge number of our complaints came from the restaurant industry, which, as the study shows, is a huge area of true wage theft problems. We could have spent all of our time pursuing individual investigations in eating and drinking and recovering a lot of back wages for a lot of workers who deserved them. What we tried to do was develop this idea of a theory of the case. What part of that problem were we going to take on in order to change employer behavior in a sustainable way, in part by understanding and using complaints as a way to really hone in on particular areas which we had identified as priorities. So complaints can be and should be a very important part of a strategic enforcement approach, as long as you think about them in this more proactive way.
Great, thanks, David. I'm going to throw out a couple of questions for you and the other panelists who can jump in. So one is very specific from Greg in San Francisco, which is, can you give an example of how you would prove an unpaid wages case without worker involvement or testimony? And I'll let Jen, if she wants to jump in, also jump in there. Greg, we know you're an expert on this too, so we'll do our best. And then Peter Ludwig from the Colorado Department of Labor, I apologize if I pronounce your last name incorrectly, has questions for us about success stories for methods of outreach to specific industries to prompt changes in their practice, which I know is something many people here have thought about extensively. And just one more for, I'll throw this out, and if all our panelists can keep their answers short for us. Sally Dworak Fisher in Maryland has a question about, I'm trying to figure out how to summarize it, but it's so good. Everybody knows as we gear up for the next legislative session that there's a lot of attention paid to struggling businesses, and particularly small businesses. We hear a lot about small businesses without remembering that workers are the ones that fuel those businesses. So is there research, or could there be by state, that rigorously quantifies the impact of wage theft on state coffers, i.e. lost UI contributions, increased reliance on public benefits, decreases to the tax base, to show that, you know, a race to the bottom has real costs? So thank you, Sally, for that question. I have a couple more, but let me turn those over for some brief answers.
So I'll start. I'm trying to go back to your first question about the need for workers. I don't know if, Greg, you're asking a trick question there. I would say to really make a case, you need to have workers engaged with it. And I know from your own experience, you would testify to that. I mean, the great example that immediately came to mind in hearing your question was our work, which we did in the agricultural industry, where you have some of the workers who experience some of the worst cases of wage theft, to say nothing of the problem of child labor problems, violations of H-2A and other kinds of protections. We had one of the greatest problems in getting workers there to talk to us and to trust our investigators. And that took years to really develop a relationship that I fear, given what has happened in the last 4 years, is going to need to be rebuilt again to gain that trust of a workforce that often is undocumented status. But building those cases, and it was an area we used our hot goods authority to great effect and to great controversy. But we often needed those workers to help work with us. So yeah, I can think of cases where we built the case without that, but I would say the important lesson that I would take away from my experience at Wage and Hour is, this is why figuring out working with worker advocates, building bonds with workers through other institutions as well. We work with consulates, for example, to build some of those trusts, is absolutely essential to the work we're undertaking.
Thanks, David. Jen, did you want to jump in?
Well, I was going to actually take the outreach question and just point to an article by Matthew Johnson, which has been cited a lot, but it's called Regulation by Shaming. And it looked at press releases about OSHA's investigative outcomes and found that a press release about one facility leads to 2.1 fewer violations at other facilities in the same sector within a 5-kilometer radius, a decrease of 88%. That is a really great report, and it's a little bit different than outreach, but it's really about the need to publicize investigative outcomes to deter other employers outside of those that have just been investigated from non-compliance. So that might be of interest or of use.
And I will give a shameless plug right there that Terry Gerstein and I produced a paper using many of the things we've worked on with Jen and David on strategic communications. So we'd be happy to share that with you all as well. Jen, while I have, oh, go ahead, David.
Just one quick point, on another dimension of this. I think one of the mistakes we often hear agencies take is to say we can either do outreach or enforcement, that somehow these things are substitutes. I would emphasize they are not. They are complements, that you want to be moving on both aspects. Certainly, Matt Johnson's work that Jen cites says a lot about needing to publicize enforcement so it has bigger deterrent effects. People don't know you're doing it, they're not going to know you're doing it. So it's part of what I think is an important part, is making an agency look, in a sense, bigger than it is. But I also think figuring out ways to do partnerships is key to this notion I had in the definition about sustainability. But you can build those partnerships at the same time as having a robust enforcement effort. They're not substitutes, they're very much complements.
Perfect. And Jen and David, while I have you both. So Jen, from Ivan Cuevas, the question is, are there interviewing techniques or practices such as trauma-informed approaches to aid vulnerable workers to come forward? And while you're thinking about that, I'll flag for David, one of our early questions is, or for anybody, what are your thoughts on the deterrent value of partnering with other agencies, since you just mentioned partnerships, to bring criminal charges in the case of egregious willful violations? So I'll turn it to Jen first.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think I would really pivot a little bit and just talk more about co-enforcement. What we know is that vulnerable workers are often intimidated and unlikely to speak directly with public employees or investigators, and so really working with organizations who already have the trust of vulnerable workforces and who already understand how to work with those workers, who speak their language, who have cultural understandings, are sort of your best resource for really trying to get full cooperation from vulnerable workers in these types of investigations.
And let me speak to the second question. Partnering with other agencies is absolutely essential. It's a very important part of the toolbox. One of the things we spent a lot of time at in Wage and Hour was creating memorandums of understanding with our state partners. And we had a whole range of those. Some of them were very deep relationships. Others were more just MOUs that really didn't lead to very much. I'll tell you again, one of the value of an MOU, whether or not there is much there, is the signaling effect. And it helps an agency look bigger than it is. We had an MOU with the IRS that I think really had a huge deterrent impact, quite separate from its actual impact on how we shared information and what that relationship looked like. But I'll also say where we do have productive relationships, and we had this at the federal level too, with partner agencies, not only even in the Labor Department, but across other parts of federal government, where you can leverage different authorities and penalty structures, and in some cases criminal authority, in a way that can have very important strategic impacts. And a state agency also has those kind of opportunities of thinking about partnering. There's great examples, and I think CWO has documented some of these, of state agencies working with licensing agencies, in industries like restaurants, where the licensing authority is incredibly powerful. And if you can work out arrangements where a pattern of wage theft can be a precondition for not granting someone another liquor license or something like that for demonstrable supported reasons, that can be a very powerful tool of improving enforcement authority and outcomes for working people.
Thanks, David. So I'm going to direct one question to Jen from April Shabazz about how you handle a case where employees were only paid in cash to avoid taxes. And then I'm going to flag, we still haven't answered Sally's great question about the impacts of non-compliance downstream by businesses and or upstream, I suppose, all around. And then I'm going to read out a question because I think it's a great question, but I don't even know who to direct it to, which is from Sebastian Green. To what degree can machine learning be used in proactive enforcement to identify types of employers who have a higher likelihood of non-compliance? Are these tools effective? Do they have a sound legal basis? Okay, so we'll turn over to Jen first for April's specific question.
Sure. So I think the first thing I would ask is there a rebuttable presumption of a violation for non-compliance with record keeping, right? We've seen that a lot in recent state and local legislation. That can help you get the employer on the hook. The other thing that's going to be, well, and just because they're paid in cash doesn't mean there's not records, right? So really like doing the investigation to see if you can get any sort of records. And then in these types of cases where there are no records, it's going to be incredibly important to get worker participation. And again, that's going to mean it's going to be a lot of interviews. It's going to be more work. And that's one of the reasons that the rebuttable presumption for record keeping requirements is so important, because it can help disincentivize that type of hiding the proof that the employer is actually not in compliance. But engaging workers, getting testimony about the hours they work, really documenting that, potentially maybe it's harder now, but surveillance of the workplace to see if you can document when workers are going in, when they're leaving, so you have objective records yourself of what those hours are. That's going to be, it's going to be more time intensive, it's going to be more resource intensive, but those are the types of investigations that the most vulnerable workforces are really going to be really going to need to get to the bottom of it. And just to go back to the question about repercussions of wage theft, I haven't seen anything specific to Maryland, but I know that EPI, and there was a report done, I think, for DOL in 2014 about tax loss and the increased need for public benefits for workers who experience wage theft. And I can find those reports and send those over.
No, I was just going to jump in on that, say the exact same thing. It's a 2014 report commissioned by the Department of Labor that the Eastern Research Group put together. And it shows that in California and New York, for example, in 2010 alone, I think it's minimum wage violations alone, California lost 74 million federal income taxes. There were 74 million that were lost, 167 million federal payroll taxes were lost, total federal 241 million. And then in the state income taxes, they lost 14 million in California, 8 million in New York in state income taxes for minimum wage violations alone. And if you want to write to one of us, we can send you the piece.
And I can let me pick up on that. Yeah, you were giving me a walk down memory lane. That was I remember the report well. But there's some additional newer reports also done, particularly around state losses from misclassification of workers as independent contractors. I would point to the work of James Parrott, who's at the New School now, but published some studies with the Fiscal Policy Institute. And there's a very new study, very interesting study by Dale Bellman from Michigan State University, looking at the tax losses arising from misclassification in construction, which is a perennial problem, and there are lots of studies of that going way back. I would just make one other quick point on that, and then I'll say a quick point about machine learning. This whole argument about small businesses, I think we have to be very careful about it, because our laws give a pass to small businesses. We should be sensitive to the specific needs and pressures of small businesses, particularly small businesses who are tied into relationships with larger organizations, often being forced to push down at lower costs, really violations that should be attributed to the parent organization but show up in the small business level. It's again thinking about the theory of the case. Why are we seeing violations among small businesses? There are a lot of different reasons. Secondly, I always think we can't lose sight about a small business struggling is something we should be concerned about. But the answer to that struggle isn't taking out a no interest loan on your workforce. And that's what wage theft is. That's not an appropriate response to a business pressure situation. And yet it's all too often that's the case. The point on machine learning, I think there are, I'm actually involved in a new project trying to see what can we get from AI and machine learning, really cool stuff. It's certainly one of the new toys in the toy chest of academics. And I think there's promise potential with it, but I would also emphasize you don't need to do machine learning and have AI and be able to do the huge analysis to do strategic enforcement. I think sometimes nitty-gritty analyses you can do with the information you have available, with analytic help you can get from worker advocacy organization or from academics, and the kind of partnership we saw in this report is really important. Use what you have. At the same time, we should continue to look at the frontier of analytic sophistication for understanding more complex relationships.
Thank you. I almost want to end there because it's such a great point about not taking out a no interest loan on your employees. But we do have one more question for you, David, from Joseph Petreka, which is, can you talk a little bit about effectively applying pressure points in an industry to help impact long-term compliance?
I'll do that in 1 minute. I mean, that's a great question.
I know you have a lot of thoughts about that.
Yes, it's a huge question. Basically, what I would say, it all depends on what's the theory of the case, what's the nature of the industry you're looking at, how do you connect the dots. One of the initiatives that I think all of us at Wage Now are very proud of is our efforts in the franchised fast food industry, and trying to figure out how do you bring compliance to a system of franchising, even in a world where you couldn't necessarily assert joint employment. And one of the answers to that is you work the problem from multiple perspectives. You do the hard enforcement work and create patterns of violations, which we found in the case of a number of major fast food companies. At the same time, you work the problem in terms of understanding where is it coming from. Is it the new franchisee? Is it the nature of the franchise contract? And you work the problem, going back to this kind of work Matt Johnson has done in terms of PR. I mean, in a situation like that, the franchise and the brand has a lot of value, and you can sometimes get a company to the table to talk about what they care about, which is their brand identity, in order to talk about what an agency should be caring about, and that's compliance with the law. I think in understanding and assessing different structures, getting the theory of the case is then critical to figuring out what are the appropriate pressure points in those situations.
Thank you so much, David, and everybody. And thank you all for these amazing questions. I think just they show how kind of in the weeds and expert you are, and also how big picture thinking all of you are doing this at the state and local level. So we so appreciate being able to work with you on this. And because I've gotten a few questions, we will post the slide deck and the presentation on our website. And we will share that also with CWO. So we'll be sure to share that out after the webinar. And I'll turn it back over to Janice.
We want to thank you all for your attention. We want to thank our wonderful panelists. We want to thank Washington Center for Equitable Growth again for supporting this study, and the Spitzer Foundation and the Ford Foundation and the Cerdna Foundation and all of the foundations that have made it possible for us to do the research that we are able to do. And to say to all of you that are out there doing this work every day, how much we respect you, how much we lift up what you've done, and how difficult we know these times are for everyone. And all the more important for us to be community to each other, to create the spaces and the places where we can come together. We plan to continue to hold webinars and to offer spaces for learning and sharing with each other. As Jen mentioned earlier, we'll be doing a enforcement during the recession series of webinars. And please reach out to us if there's anything that you would like to follow up with. Thanks again to Tanya Goldman the Great and to CLASP, fantastic partner to us in all of this. And we'll see you all very, very soon again. Be well, and thanks very much.